Millionaire marries a poor and unattractive gardener to get revenge on his ex, but on their wedding night, the sprawling estate of Theo Hayes was a sight to behold, with manicured gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly. It was a picture of order, wealth, and power, the very essence of Theo himself. Standing near the greenhouse, Lucy Harper wiped the dirt from her hands, oblivious to the man approaching her. She had no time to admire the life of luxury around her. Every minute counted when you were scraping by to pay for your mother's medical bills. Theo's footsteps on the gravel path were deliberate, each step measured as though he was walking into a boardroom. The sharp suit, the chiseled jawline, and the air of control around him made people take notice, and usually stay out of his way. But Lucy wasn't one to be easily intimidated, even by a man as commanding as Theo. "Miss Harper," he called, his tone clipped. Lucy turned, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. She didn't smile. She rarely did these days. "Yes, Mr. Hayes," she replied, straightening her posture. Theo studied her for a moment. She was nothing like Charlotte, his ex-fiancée who had been all glamour and pretension. Lucy was grounded, practical, and completely unaware of her natural charm. Theo's jaw tightened as he remembered Charlotte's betrayal, the humiliation he'd endured when she had left him for a rival businessman. Now, he had a plan. "Walk with me," Theo said, gesturing toward the garden path. Lucy hesitated but complied, following him silently. She wasn't sure what this was about, but she wasn't in a position to say no to the man who signed her paychecks. "I'll be straightforward," Theo began, his tone all business. "I need a wife." Lucy stopped in her tracks, stunned. She stared at him as though he'd just suggested she sprout wings and fly. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice sharp. "It's not what you think," Theo clarified, turning to face her. "This isn't about romance or love. It's about strategy. My ex-fiancée, Charlotte, betrayed me and made me a laughingstock in my circles. I need to make a statement, one that says I've moved on, and I've done so with someone unexpected." Lucy folded her arms, her expression guarded. "And you thought of me? You're hard-working, independent, and completely unconnected to the world I live in," Theo said. "You're perfect for this. In return, I'll cover all your mother's medical expenses and set you up financially. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement." Lucy's mind raced. The audacity of the proposal left her reeling, but the mention of her mother's medical bills hit her where it hurt most. She'd been working double shifts, skipping meals and losing sleep trying to make ends meet. But this? Marrying Theo Hayes for money? "I don't know what kind of woman you think I am, but I don't sell myself to the highest bidder," Lucy snapped, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "It's not like that," Theo said, his tone softening slightly. "I'm offering you a way out of a difficult situation. Think of it as a business deal." Lucy shook her head, trying to process the situation. This was insane. She barely knew the man, and he was asking her to upend her entire life. "Why me?" she finally asked. "Because you're nothing like Charlotte," Theo admitted, his voice low, "and because you have everything to gain from this." His words hung in the air. Lucy hated the truth in them. She thought of her mother, frail and struggling, in a small, overcrowded hospital room. She thought of the bills piling up and the hopelessness that weighed on her every day. Theo sensed her hesitation and pressed on. "I'm not asking you to love me or even pretend to. This is just a temporary arrangement, one that benefits us both." Lucy exhaled shakily, the weight of her reality pressing down on her. "And what happens when this arrangement ends?" "You walk away with enough money to rebuild your life," Theo said simply. No strings attached. The deal was clear, cold, calculated, just like Theo himself. Lucy looked at him, trying to gauge whether he was hiding something, but his expression was unreadable. "Give me time to think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have until tomorrow," Theo replied, turning and walking away. That night, Lucy lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling. Her pride and her desperation waged a silent battle. Could she really sell her freedom, her dignity for money? But wasn't she already sacrificing everything for her mother? By morning, her decision was made. When she met Theo in his office later that day, She looked him squarely in the eye. "I'll do it," she said firmly. "But I have conditions. I won't be your puppet and I won't let you humiliate me." Theo's lips curved into a faint smile, more of satisfaction than warmth. "Understood." And with that, the papers were signed, and Lucy Harper became Mrs. Theo Hayes. The wedding was a cold, sterile affair, a quick ceremony in Theo's private office with only a few witnesses. As Lucy slipped on the ring, she felt its weight more than she expected. It was done. But as Theo escorted her out, his hand barely brushing hers, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a deal with the devil. Lucy stood at the entrance of Theo's grand mansion, clutching her small suitcase tightly. The estate loomed before her, its opulence overwhelming and utterly foreign. She'd lived a life of practicality, where every dollar mattered and simplicity reigned. Now she was stepping into a world where extravagance was the norm, and she wasn't sure she belonged. "Mrs. Hayes," a well-dressed butler greeted her with a polite nod. The title felt alien to her ears, like a costume she wasn't meant to wear. "Lucy," she corrected, her voice soft but firm. "This way, ma'am," the butler replied, ignoring her correction as he led her inside. The marble floors gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, and the air smelled faintly of fresh roses, likely from the arrangements scattered throughout the house. Everything about this place screamed wealth, power, and control. Lucy couldn't help but feel out of place, a speck of dirt in a pristine world. Theo appeared at the top of the grand staircase, his presence commanding as always. He descended with the precision of someone who knew he owned the space he walked in. His dark eyes flicked to her suitcase, then back to her. "That's all you brought?" he asked, a hint of incredulity in his voice. "I don't have much," Lucy replied, lifting her chin. "This is everything I need." His gaze lingered on her for a moment, unreadable, before he motioned for her to follow. "You'll stay in the East Wing. Your quarters are ready." The word quarters made Lucy bristle, as though she were a guest in her own life, but she followed him silently, her footsteps echoing through the vast halls. When they reached her room, a suite larger than her entire apartment, Theo opened the door and gestured for her to enter. "You'll find appropriate attire in the wardrobe," he said curtly. "There's a charity gala tomorrow night, and you'll need to be presentable." Lucy turned to face him, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "Let's get one thing straight, Theo. I may have agreed to this arrangement, but I'm not some doll you can dress up and parade around." Theo's lips curved into a cold smile. "No, you're not. But appearances matter in my world. You agreed to this, Lucy. That means you play your part." Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Instead, she walked into the room and closed the door behind her, leaning against it as she tried to steady her nerves. The next evening, Lucy stood in front of the floor-length mirror, adjusting the hem of the designer gown Theo's assistant had chosen for her. The dress was stunning, deep emerald silk that hugged her figure and contrasted beautifully with her auburn hair. She barely recognized herself. The door opened without a knock, and Theo stepped in, dressed in a sharp black tuxedo. His gaze swept over her, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes. "You clean up well," he said, his tone neutral, but Lucy detected a trace of surprise. "Gee, thanks," she replied dryly, smoothing the fabric nervously. Theo extended his arm, and she hesitated before taking it. "Just remember," he said as they walked toward the car waiting outside, "this is all about appearances. Smile, nod, and don't let anyone get too close." "Got it," Lucy muttered, already feeling the weight of the night ahead. The gala was held at an opulent hotel downtown with a red carpet lined with paparazzi. As Theo's car pulled up, Lucy's nerves threatened to consume her. She'd never been the center of attention, and now she was about to step into a world where every glance felt like a judgment. Theo stepped out first, offering her his hand. She took it, grateful for the support, even if it was for show. The cameras flashed incessantly as they walked toward the entrance, Theo's hand resting lightly on her back. Inside, the room was a sea of glittering gowns, expensive jewelry, and false smiles. Lucy felt eyes on her from every direction, curious, calculating, some outright dismissive. "Who's she?" a woman whispered loudly enough for Lucy to hear. She doesn't look like she belongs. Lucy's cheeks burned, but she kept her head high, refusing to let the whispers get to her. "Don't let them rattle you," Theo murmured, his voice low and surprisingly steadying. "They're vultures, you'll get used to it." "Comforting," Lucy muttered, earning a faint smirk from Theo. The evening dragged on, with Theo introducing her to people she'd never heard of, each handshake feeling like a test she wasn't prepared for. Charlotte's presence loomed in the back of her mind, though she hadn't yet made an appearance. But then, as the night wore on, Lucy spotted her. Charlotte, with her flawless blonde waves and a dress that seemed designed to turn heads, approached with the grace of someone who knew she owned the room. "Theo," Charlotte said smoothly, her voice dripping with familiarity. "And this must be Lucy, is it?" Lucy forced a polite smile. "Yes. Nice to meet you." Charlotte's eyes lingered on her, assessing. "I must say, Theo, your taste has evolved." The jab was subtle but unmistakable. Lucy's stomach churned, but she held her ground, refusing to let Charlotte see her falter. Theo's expression hardened. "Lucy is my wife, Charlotte. I suggest you show her the respect she deserves." Charlotte's smile faltered for a split second before she recovered. "Of course, my apologies." As she walked away, Lucy turned to Theo, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's going to be a problem, isn't she?" Theo's jaw tightened. "Let her try." Lucy didn't feel reassured. In fact, as she watched Charlotte move effortlessly through the crowd, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of the storm. The days following the gala were a whirlwind of obligations and adjustments. Lucy found herself thrust deeper into Theo's world, where every move seemed choreographed and every interaction veiled by ulterior motives. She attended meetings, dinners, and events, each more exhausting than the last. While she wore the dresses and smiled for the cameras, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was playing a role she wasn't prepared for. Theo, on the other hand, seemed unshaken by the social minefield they navigated. He moved with confidence, his charm disarming, his control absolute. But behind his polished exterior, Lucy began to sense a tension that hadn't been there before, a flicker of vulnerability that surfaced only when he thought no one was watching. One afternoon, Lucy stood on the balcony of the mansion, staring out at the meticulously groomed gardens she once tended. They felt like a distant memory now, a piece of her old life that no longer fit. "You miss it, don't you?" She turned to find Theo standing behind her, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Miss what?" she asked cautiously. "The simplicity," he said. "The quiet." Lucy's gaze returned to the gardens. "It's not just that. I miss feeling like I had control over my own life. Out there," she gestured to the estate. "It was hard, but at least it was real. Here, everything feels like a performance." Theo's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice lower. "You think I don't feel that way too?" Lucy turned to him, surprised. "You? Mr. Perfectly Composed Hayes?" A wry smile tugged at his lips. "Even this." He gestured vaguely, as if encompassing their entire arrangement. "Even this is part of the act." She studied him for a moment, her defenses softening slightly. "Why do you do it then? Why not just walk away?" Theo's smile faded. "Because walking away means losing. And I don't lose." The conversation lingered in Lucy's mind long after Theo left. For the first time, she saw glimpses of a man behind the mask, a man who was just as trapped as she was, though by different chains. The tension between them came to a head at a charity auction a week later. The event was another glittering affair, with the city's elite gathered to flaunt their wealth under the guise of philanthropy. Lucy had grown used to the stares, but tonight they felt sharper, more deliberate. Whispers buzzed through the room like static electricity, and it didn't take long for Lucy to understand why. A reporter approached her during a quiet moment, holding up a glossy magazine. "Mrs. Hayes, care to comment on this?" Lucy froze as her eyes landed on the headline, "Marriage or Merger? The Hayes Contract Exposed." Beneath it was a photo of her and Theo, taken at their wedding, paired with snippets of legal jargon from what could only be their prenuptial agreement. The blood drained from her face. Theo appeared at her side almost instantly, his hand gripping her elbow as he steered her away from the crowd. "Don't say a word," he muttered under his breath. In the privacy of a side room, Lucy spun on him, her eyes blazing. "You said this was under control. How did they get the contract?" Theo's jaw clenched, his frustration evident. "I don't know, but I'll handle it." "Handle it?" Lucy's voice rose. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? Everyone out there thinks I'm some gold-digging trophy wife who sold herself for a paycheck." Theo stepped closer, his expression hard. "I told you from the beginning this wouldn't be easy. You knew what you were signing up for." "I signed up to help my mother," Lucy shot back, her voice trembling. "Not to become your pawn in some revenge game." Her words hit him like a blow, and for a moment, Theo said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost vulnerable. "It's not just about revenge." Lucy stared at him, her anger momentarily tempered by confusion. But before she could press him further, the door burst open, and Charlotte swept in, her presence like a gust of icy wind. "Well, well," Charlotte said with a smug smile. "Looks like the perfect couple isn't so perfect after all." "What do you want, Charlotte?" Theo snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. Charlotte tilted her head, feigning innocence. "I came to congratulate you, of course. The press is absolutely eating this up. You're the talk of the town." "Get out," Theo growled, his patience visibly fraying. But Charlotte ignored him, turning her attention to Lucy. "You must feel so foolish, dear. Did you really think he chose you for anything other than convenience? You're nothing more than a tool to him." "Enough!" Theo's voice boomed, startling both women, but Lucy didn't need Charlotte to spell it out. The truth was already there, glaring at her like a neon sign. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Without another word, she pushed past both of them and left the room, her steps quick and determined. That night, Lucy packed her things. She couldn't stay, not like this. Theo found her in the hallway, her suitcase by her side. "Where are you going?" "Home," she said simply, her voice devoid of emotion. "You can't just leave," Theo said, his tone softening as he stepped closer. "We have a deal." "I don't care about the deal," Lucy interrupted, her voice trembling with anger. "I won't be your puppet, Theo. I'm done being used." For the first time, Theo looked genuinely panicked. "Lucy, please." "No." She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resolve. "This, whatever this was, it's over." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Theo standing alone in the hallway, his world suddenly quieter and emptier than it had been in years. The days after Lucy left were a haze for Theo. The mansion, once a symbol of his power and success, now felt hollow. He buried himself in work, throwing all his energy into meetings, deals, and anything that could distract him from the growing void. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't ignore the silence. His assistants tiptoed around him, wary of his terse commands and brooding demeanor. Even the once pristine gardens looked less vibrant, as if the life had been drained from the estate itself. But it wasn't just the absence of Lucy that haunted him. It was the realization that he'd lost more than a pawn in his game of revenge. He'd lost someone who had seen past his carefully constructed facade, someone who had made him question the man he had become. Lucy, on the other hand, was determined to rebuild her life. She returned to her modest apartment, juggling her work as a freelance landscaper while continuing to care for her mother. The scandal hadn't completely faded, and whispers followed her wherever she went, but she forced herself to focus on what mattered. She tried to convince herself that she was better off without Theo, but her heart betrayed her. Late at night, she found herself thinking about his rare moments of vulnerability, the fleeting glimpses of the man behind the mask. But those moments weren't enough to erase the pain of his betrayal. The turning point for Theo came when he received a call from one of his oldest friends, a blunt but loyal confidant named Marcus. "You look like hell," Marcus said the moment Theo answered their video call. "Thanks for the observation," Theo replied dryly. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying him. "You're a mess, let me guess. This has something to do with the wife you let walk out on you?" Theo scowled but didn't deny it. Marcus sighed. Listen, Theo, I've known you for years, and I've seen you destroy anyone who gets in your way, but this isn't about winning, is it? Theo's jaw tightened. It's complicated. No, it's not, Marcus said firmly. You're in love with her, and unless you get over yourself and admit it, you're going to lose her for good. The words hit Theo like a punch to the gut. Love? He'd spent so long convincing himself that love was a weakness, a liability. But as he sat in the quiet of his office, Marcus's words echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront the truth he'd been avoiding. A week later, Lucy was in the middle of a job, planting hydrangeas in the front yard of a client's home, when a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. She recognized it immediately. Theo stepped out looking uncharacteristically nervous. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored suit. Instead, he was dressed casually in dark jeans and a sweater, as if trying to appear less imposing. Lucy straightened, brushing the dirt from her hands. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice guarded. "I needed to see you," Theo said, his tone sincere. Lucy crossed her arms. "Haven't you done enough?" Theo exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I messed up, Lucy, I know that, and I don't blame you for leaving." Her expression remained unchanged, but she didn't interrupt him. "I thought I could control everything, our arrangement, my feelings, even you," Theo continued. "But I was wrong. You're not a pawn, Lucy. You're the only real thing I've had in my life in years." Lucy's chest tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "And what do you want me to do with that, Theo? Forgive you? Pretend everything's fine?" "No," Theo said quickly. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted you to know that I'm trying to be better, not for anyone else, just for me, and if you'll let me, I want to prove that I'm not the man who hurt you." Lucy searched his face, looking for any trace of insincerity, but for the first time she saw no walls, no mask, just a man who looked genuinely vulnerable. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I'll earn it," Theo promised, "however long it takes." Over the next few weeks, Theo made good on his word. He donated a substantial amount to the hospital where Lucy's mother was being treated, ensuring she received the best care possible. But it wasn't a grand gesture he paraded around. It was quiet, almost private, as if he didn't want credit. He also began volunteering with local charities, using his resources to support causes he'd once ignored. And while he tried to stay out of Lucy's way, he made small, thoughtful gestures, delivering a new set of gardening tools to her door, sending fresh flowers with handwritten notes that never asked for anything in return. Slowly, Lucy began to see that his actions weren't about winning her back. They were about becoming someone worth being with. Then, one morning, Lucy's world shifted again. She sat in her apartment, staring at the small plastic stick in her hand, 2 pink lines. Her breath hitched, and she felt the weight of 1,000 emotions crash over her. Fear, disbelief, joy, and confusion. She was pregnant. She debated telling Theo, but part of her hesitated. She didn't want him to feel obligated, and she certainly didn't want to become trapped in another arrangement. But deep down, she knew he deserved to know. When she finally told him, Theo's reaction wasn't what she expected. "You're pregnant?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucy nodded, bracing herself for his response. For a moment, Theo said nothing. Then, to her astonishment, he smiled, not the sharp, calculating smile she'd grown used to, but a soft, genuine one. "I don't know how to be a father," he admitted, "but I'll figure it out. I'll do whatever it takes to be there for you and for our child." Lucy felt her resolve crumble, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward together. The weeks following Lucy's revelation unfolded in a delicate, tentative rhythm. Theo, true to his word, began to make preparations for their child's arrival. He transformed one of the mansion's grand rooms into a nursery, not with the cold efficiency of a man delegating a task, but with the quiet thoughtfulness of someone deeply invested. Lucy was surprised when Theo insisted she choose every detail, from the crib to the paint color. "I want it to feel like home," he said simply, when she questioned his involvement. Lucy was skeptical at first, unsure if this transformation in Theo was genuine or just another calculated move. But as days turned into weeks, she began to see a man who was truly trying. He wasn't perfect, old habits of control and pride occasionally surfaced, but he apologized when he faltered and sought to correct himself, and that, Lucy realized, was more than she ever expected. Meanwhile, Charlotte, refusing to be sidelined, made one last desperate attempt to disrupt their fragile progress. She orchestrated a meeting with Lucy, ambushing her at a local cafe. "Lucy," Charlotte began, her voice dripping with feigned sympathy, "I thought we should talk, woman to woman." Lucy set her coffee cup down and met Charlotte's gaze evenly. "What do you want?" "I want to save you from making a terrible mistake," Charlotte said, leaning in conspiratorially. "You think Theo has changed, but trust me, he hasn't. He's just playing the long game, that's who he is." Lucy's stomach churned, but she kept her composure. "Why are you so invested in this? You left him. You're the one who cheated." Charlotte's expression faltered briefly before she recovered. "I made a mistake, yes, but I know Theo better than anyone. He's incapable of real love. You're nothing more than a convenient distraction." Lucy's heart ached, but she refused to let Charlotte see her doubt. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice firm. "Maybe he was that man once, but I've seen him try to change, and even if he fails, it's my choice to believe in him, not yours." Charlotte's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of frustration. "You'll regret this." "I doubt it," Lucy said calmly, standing to leave. For the first time in months, she walked away from Charlotte feeling empowered rather than shaken. As Lucy's due date approached, she and Theo began to settle into a tentative partnership. They still had their moments of friction, but they were learning to navigate their differences. Lucy even returned to the gardens on the estate, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of planting and pruning. One evening, as she worked on a particularly stubborn patch of weeds, Theo joined her, rolling up his sleeves and kneeling beside her. "You don't have to do this," Lucy said, arching an eyebrow at him. "I know," Theo replied, pulling at a root, "but I want to." They worked in silence for a while, the quiet punctuated by the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. Finally, Theo spoke. "Do you ever think about what happens after the baby comes?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Lucy paused, wiping her hands on her jeans. "All the time." "And?" She looked at him, her expression softening. "And, I think we'll figure it out. Together." Theo met her gaze, and for the first time, he allowed himself to hope. The day Lucy went into labor was chaotic, as expected. Theo, usually so composed, was a bundle of nerves pacing the hospital hallway while Lucy endured hours of contractions. When their son was finally born, Theo stood frozen, staring at the tiny bundle in his arms. "He's perfect," Theo whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Lucy, exhausted but smiling, watched as Theo held their son with a mixture of awe and fear. "What should we name him?" she asked. Theo looked at her, then back at the baby. "Theodore," he said after a moment. "Theodore James Hayes." Lucy laughed softly. "After you?" Theo shook his head. "After us. A fresh start." In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new kind of normal. The mansion, once cold and empty, was now filled with the sounds of a newborn and the warmth of a family learning to grow together. Theo continued to prove his commitment, not just to Lucy and their son, but to himself. He stepped back from his cutthroat business practices, focusing on projects that gave back to the community. He even helped Lucy establish her own landscaping business, turning part of the estate into a showcase garden for her clients. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Theo reached for Lucy's hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For believing in me when I didn't deserve it, for giving me a chance to be someone better." Lucy squeezed his hand, a small smile playing on her lips. "You did the work, Theo. I just gave you the push." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in a warm golden light, Lucy felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Their journey had been messy and painful, but it had brought them here to a place of love, trust, and hope. The garden, once a symbol of manipulation and control, now stood as a testament to growth, resilience, and the power of second chances. And in that moment, surrounded by the life they'd built together, Lucy knew they were finally home.